After e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6. Black is playing classical Sicilian, so we play bishop b5, Rossolimo, g6 by black. This is the main move, and we castle and bishop g7. So this is how black is playing this game. So the variation with the classical Sicilian and the bishop in fianchetto. As we know, we take this knight. Now in the previous video we went through b takes and everything that happens next. In this video we're going to look at this move, d takes. And we haven't looked at anything like this before. So how to continue? Okay, the right move is a4, and the idea is to play a5 and a6, simple as that. So let's explore a few options now. If black plays knight f6 right now, which seems to be making perfect sense, you play d3 and black castles. Okay, a5. And now, what to do? Let's look at two options. One of them is e5 by black to stop us from going forward, because remember, a5 is important, not only to just stop b6 from happening, because you can take it, and then we see if b6 comes, you can take it. Black can't take back, because then you will win rook. The queen taking back means that black will have a double isolated pawn. Black to move. Two moves, e5 or knight e8. If knight to e8, knight to d2. And now, if black plays e5 now, you play knight to b3. We're targeting this weakness in c5. And this cannot be stopped in any way. Remember, c4 cannot be played because he will just take it for free. This is absolutely fine for white. I mean, we're up a pawn. There's a clean pawn up with no compensation whatsoever. If black instead plays queen to d6 to protect the pawn, remember, a5 is crucial in stopping b6. This is the most important thing you have to know in the entire opening, how to deal with this. Okay, bishop e3 capitalizes on that weakness. So that doesn't work. So in this position, after we just played knight b to d2, what if black plays f5? I've encountered this move personally. The idea is to simply open the file for the rook. Take the pawn, and when the bishop takes back, developing rook to e1, targeting the isolated pawn. So this is a rubbish idea by black. And knight to f6, knight back to f6. Now, you're probably wondering, why knight e8 in the first place? Well, because you'll see what was going to happen. We're going to see that in a minute. So, because now the knight is forced to go to f6, so it's a bit silly, but I'll explain that in a second. h3 by white, and after knight going to d5, the knight goes to c4. This is a completely winning position for white already. Queen c7, these are all best moves. Bishop g5, putting pressure on the weak pawn. So after e5 finally comes, bishop h4 is the best move. The idea is to go to g3 and pin that pawn, and eventually we will take it. Rook a to e8, bishop g3. And after knight to f4, best move by black, stopping the influence of that bishop. Obviously, now we play queen d2, put more attack over that knight. And we're going to be winning a pawn, and the game doesn't get any easier than this. What about bishop h6, defending? Queen to c3, putting enough attack over this pawn in e5. This cannot be defended because, you see, if the bishop goes back to g7, you simply take. So there's no way to defend that. Knight to d5 with an attack on the queen doesn't work. You just take the pawn in c5. So what about bishop taking the knight? Okay. Knight takes back. And obviously now we remove the pawn and we also attacking this knight. It's completely over. So in this position, instead of bishop g7 trying to defend the pawn, what if e4? Seems to be making sense. Okay, take it. Bishop takes back, and now knight to e5. And now we're threatening to take this bishop because the knight is working as a shield. If the bishop goes to g7, simply take the bishop and you're attacking, you're protecting the knight properly. If instead the bishop takes your knight first, knight takes back. And when the bishop goes to g7 attacking the queen, queen to c4 puts double attack on this knight. But at the very least, just saves the queen. And we go on in a completely winning endgame. Especially because the knight is stuck in there, and after trading rooks, this bishop and the queen will be attacking the knight together, so you're winning material as well. This leads us to a recap. You might be wondering, why did I choose such a bad move by black? But actually, that's a very popular move. It happens a lot. The reason being that now, okay, let me show you. Castle, bishop g7, take, and now d takes. Okay, a4. And the early knight f6. So d3 to protect the pawn, castle, a5. So why did we go through knight e8? Seems like a stupid move. Well, the problem is that now that we have a pawn in a5 attacking b6, we're threatening something here. Here our plan is very simple. We want to play moves like knight d2, h3, queen e1, knight b3, and go for this pawn. That's literally what you want to do. So in this position, what if black, instead of that move knight e8, plays, or remember, we're going to look at a lot of stuff. We're also going to look at bishop g4 and so on. Let's go through e5 now by black. This is very popular. Okay, queen to e1 comes now. And now this is a free pawn, right? So if bishop goes to e6, just to make an example, right? This is a free pawn. There's no compensation whatsoever. So let's go on to queen to c7. This is the main move to defend that pawn. Okay, queen to c3 puts more attack on that pawn. You see how queen e1 now makes more sense? Rook e8 defends it. h3. Let's make an example. If the bishop goes to f8 now to protect the pawn in c5, which we are attacking and which cannot be defended with b6, bishop e3 now will finalize the attack on that pawn, and that's going to be it. Also because you can play knight d2, knight b3, and you're going to win that pawn. So instead of bishop f8, what if black plays bishop to e6, developing? Well, fine, you just win this pawn, and again, zero compensation. Which leads us to another recap. Look, we're gonna make recaps until we understand everything. So castle, bishop g7, take the knight, d takes. Okay, a4. Knight f6, d3. Castle, a5. We're also gonna look at variations where black plays a5 to stop us from playing a5, which is fair enough. So e5 by black, queen e1. The idea is to put pressure on this pawn in e5 with queen c3. And earlier we went to queen c7. We know we play queen c3, which makes a fork on these two pawns. What if the knight goes to d7? This is one of the main moves. Protects both pawns and plans to play f5. Okay, queen c3 comes anyway, and now a6 by black, knight d2, f5. How to respond to this? We take, and then when the rook takes back, the rook's in an open file. Oh, by the way, let's pay attention to the fact that here, after taking the pawn in f5, black shouldn't take back the pawn, because now you can play queen b3 check, the king moves, and now knight to c4 puts a lot of attack over this square, but most importantly, allows you to play bishop to g5, which is a deadly move, especially when the bishop goes to e7 and so on, attacks the rook, and then prepares knight d6 to happen. And then the knight g5, it's an amazing position. Planning knight f7, we can all see this stuff. We can all see this stuff. So what if queen goes to e7? Now rook to e1 is the best move to put more attack over that pawn. And there's a serious problem here for the black player, because black now just can't move anything. If you move the knight, you're gonna lose this pawn because of the massive attack. You can't move the knight, you can't push this pawn because it gets taken for free. You can't develop this bishop. This rook can only go to b8, but it doesn't do anything. And you're planning to just put enough pressure on e5, which you already have. e4 can't really happen, you got too much attack on it. So after queen f7, pinning our knight and trying to like maybe calm down the initiative, considering that especially that black has the bishop pair, you could just play bishop to d2. So why is the position evaluated +3? It's been evaluated +3 for a while. It's because black can't move a thing. Whatever moves gets taken for free. Besides, blocking is much less safe. But anyway, let's go back to this position when we took in f5. The rook takes back, and now this loses to queen c4 check. The king has to move. Knight to e4. Double attack on the square g5. We want to go there. And if you look at the engine now, the best move by black is to take this knight. And obviously to reduce the attack. Also because we have, there's also an attack on c5, on d6. So pawn takes back, this double isolated pawn, but this is easy to survive. Knight f6 by black, bishop g5 pins it. Bishop h3, just move the rook, rook f2 e1. Queen to f8, unpinning the knight, take. And then takes back, and now queen takes in c5. Claiming a swap of queens, which will eventually result in a win for us, since we're up material. Queen f7, refusing the swap, only way to survive. But now take, and we can play queen to f5 and force a swap of queens, and this is a very easy to win endgame. So let's take this from the start, and now g6, the main move, castle, bishop g7, take the knight, d takes. Okay, a4. The next move we need to see is b6. This is fairly popular. Obviously, it stops a5 from happening. It should stop a5 from happening, but in the line I'm suggesting a5 comes anyway. Because when they take, then they have double isolated pawn on the a file, double isolated pawn on the c file. So that doesn't look any good. So after let's not look at this move, pawn takes. Yes, we go down a pawn, but none of these pawns islands are going to survive the endgame. Let's look at these two moves. Bishop e7 now. Okay, it's met with rook e1. Knight f6 developing, d3. Normal moves, right? Castle is a very opening, easy opening to remember. e5 punishes the player now for castling. Knight to d5, e6. Now we're threatening to just take, isolate the opponent pawn. So after pawn takes, knight b to d2, we don't even take that pawn back. And there's no way to save it. Queen to c7, for instance, knight to g5 capitalizes on that pawn, even if it cannot be defended because the knight is going to go there anyway. Even if the pawn pushes, remember that the knight in e6 is making a fork. So queen c7 is not a move there. What about e5? Pushing the pawn down and say, I'm not going to let you do that. Okay, well, take it. And after bishop takes, rook takes, and queen to d6, attacking the rook, that doesn't work because of knight c4. The queen will have to go back. And soon enough, we will capitalize on the pawn in e7. It's a very weak pawn. So if black goes back, let's say queen e7, for example, you just play a move like bishop h6, completely dominating position evaluated almost +3 for that reason. If the queen goes to f6 with the idea of going, putting pressure on f2, just play queen e2. You got nothing to worry. You're probably arguing about this move now, knight f4 being extremely annoying as only a knight can be. But remember that you're putting pressure on e7. So if you swap the knight, then you can go to e7. There's nothing to worry. This bishop is really useless. So back in this position, in the variation where where black plays b6 and we just played a5 anyway, black can't develop the bishop in the fianchetto. It doesn't make sense. What about bishop g4? Okay, d3, normal moves. Knight f6, knight d2. Castle, h3. So the bishop is now forced to take, unless he wants to go back, but then it's just wasted time. Take, and now knight to d7 is a thematic move. The idea of playing e4, e5, f5. Queen e2 comes in. After e5, blocking the center, h4 by white. We obviously would like to push h5. Anyway, if black now plays f5, take this pawn in b6. And now best by black is to take the pawn in e4 with an attack on the knight and opening the file for the rook. Just take back. And black takes you back. Swap rooks. Queen takes back. h5 is coming. And the opponent king is not going to be safe for long. b5 by black. Obviously taking the pawn is not worth seeing. b5 by black. The idea of allowing at least knight to go to b6 and develop somewhere. Although the knight is not really that much of a problem. But let's make an example here. h6, right? After b5, just play h6. That's the threat you're making. Where's the bishop going to go? If the bishop goes to h8, you play rook to d1, attacking the knight, knight b6, bishop to e3. Capitalizes like this. You're gonna win material. And if instead of bishop h8, what if bishop f6? Okay, queen to d1, knight to b6, queen to d6, attack c5. This cannot be protected. Also because you're attacking e5, you're attacking double here. Rook f7, just to make an example, right? You just play bishop to g5. This is the best move. You're going to be, it's double attack on the bishop, you're going to take it, and then play the knight to g5, and the game plays itself. Okay, so let's take it from the start, and let's look at more variations. Look, it doesn't seem like many of these lines are going to happen, but they actually will, because it's a close game. It's a fairly close game. It's not like it's the kind of game where not much can happen. So the moves that you're looking at here now will happen. At least some of these variations will happen very frequently. Bishop g7, take the knight. Pawn takes back a4. There is already not much to do. It's not an open game where black can make any, for example, if black plays bishop d7, I'm not going to cover this, but it's such a stupid move. It doesn't do anything. In this case, we went through b6, we went through knight f6. Well, let's look at this one. e5 straight away. Okay, d3. And now queen to a7. Let's look at this variation. Okay, a5 comes anyway. And after knight f6, h3. And now you see the light square bishop doesn't have anywhere to go. So after knight d7, bishop e3 developing. Knight f8. This variation has been played by very strong super grandmasters in very important events. So after knight f8, knight d2. Knight e6 now. The knight has potential Okay, knight to c4. Double attack on the pawn in e5. Queen to c7 now protecting. Okay, knight g5. And now what to do? The knight cannot be kicked out from with h6 because he will simply take. And then when the bishop takes back, then you can take this pawn for free. And it's a completely winning position for the white player. And here, after knight g5, what if the knight just takes the knight? Okay, well, take back. Castle. Looks like a normal game, but after bishop e3 attacking the pawn, there's no way to defend it. If queen to e7, to defend that pawn further, queen to d2. And now here, this is the best, actually, that the black player can get. This is the absolutely most solid variation. White is still quite fairly better, but it's, the evaluation is around plus 150 or something. So here we're gonna have to keep fighting for a bit. Bishop e6 developing. These are best moves. Queen to c3, finalizing the attack over this pawn, and especially forcing our opponent to give up the bishop pair. And that is why we're in a better position. Also, we're going to be winning the pawn in c7. The queen can't just go away to c7 to defend it. And if instead the black bishop just take the knight and say, you know what, I'm going to give up on the bishop pair just like you, but at least we carry on the endgame without me losing a pawn. Okay, queen to c4, and we're finalizing the attack on... So in this case, we have double attack on this pawn. So black has to defend it with b6. In this case, the rooks are finally connected, so it looks like it's possible. But white now just plays rook a2 and plans to play the other rook. And then you will be able to take completely for free. And if the pawn ever takes you, then bishop c5 makes a skewer. If the rook moves, not allowing you to make a skewer, you're still going to take the pawn, and then the rook in a1, you're going to be taking this pawn. This bishop in g7 is powerless because of the e5 variation. So you see how there's the little things, the minor details, they make the huge difference in chess. So let's look at another variation, the one with a5 this time. So knight c6, bishop b5, g7, castle. Okay, bishop g7, take the knight, d takes, right? a4. What if black plays a5 straight away? This is surely one of the most solid variations, and it basically stops, it allows black much greater amount of freedom than it's ever had in the previous, if black were to play otherwise. Okay, d3. And now let's look at two options, knight f6 and bishop g4. Okay, knight f6, you play bishop e3, attacking that pawn. So b6 now, this is all solid. Knight c3 comes now. And it seems weird because where are you going to put the knight? Okay, castle, h3. Stops the bishop from going to g4. Although we're going to look at what happens when the bishop goes to g4. Knight d7, let's look at this. Queen d2. And after e5, rook a to e1. So when you play the variation with a4, right, which you always do, when black plays the variation with a5, blocking the pawn, you have to obviously abandon the a file because nothing is happening there. So rook a to e1. And after f5, opening the file for the rook, take. So you always take, basically. Okay, two options here. If black takes with the pawn, you can play bishop h6 straight away, trade with that bishop. This is very important. f4 cuts off the communication between the queen and the bishop, so now you're forced to take. So I take, and a knight takes in e5. This is completely safe to play. You're winning material, and it's an amazing position. So that's just a blunder by black. So in this position, what if instead of taking it with the pawn, black takes back with the rook? Okay, bishop h6 comes. And now the idea is very simple. If black refuses the swap of bishops, let's say with bishop h8, right? You play queen e3, and now you have a lot of pressure over this square. Although you can't take it yet, but to be fair, that also stops black from moving. Black can't move anything without losing that pawn. So queen to e8, putting more defense over that pawn. Queen to e8, but now you play knight to e4. And what is the threat you're making with the knight? You're threatening knight to d6, obviously. And now you're threatening knight to d6, and it's kind of harsh to try and stop. What can our opponent do? What about queen e7? You see, you cannot really play the rook anywhere back. And now you'll play knight to g3. The rook will have to move, and once the rook has moved, let's say to g5, then you can, let's say to f7, then you can trap it with knight g5. Or maybe to f6 you might argue, but then bishop g5. So it's a position that looks like our opponent has many choices, but he actually doesn't have any. So in this position here, instead of refusing the swap, let's look at the variation where they take. Because we were going to swap, right? So you take back, and after queen f6, Seems to be making sense. Simply knight e4 attacking the queen. Queen to g7. Okay, trade, no problem at all. And you can play knight d6. And when the rook is moved, then you have double attack over e5. Rook f6 is not possible, obviously, because you got this one. So let's make one last recap and let's look at something else. Bishop b5, g6, castle, bishop g7, take the knight, d takes. Okay, a4 straight away. What if black plays bishop to g4 and says, you know what, I'm gonna take that knight before you get the chance to play d3 and knight d2. And so yes, you will take back with the queen, but it doesn't matter because you gave the bishop pair as well. And eventually, you know, black doesn't have to worry, everything is safe around here, this bishop doesn't get penalized, and especially we don't have the pressure over e5, which means the black can play e5 with tranquility. Okay, that's fine, attack the bishop, take, take. Okay, if black plays knight f6 now, d3, normal move, castle, knight d2, knight d7, queen to g3, so f5 now. Okay, knight f3. If black takes the pawn, opening the fight for the rook, knight to g5, because you're threatening to go to e6. Rook to f6, stopping that from happening. Okay, now recapture this pawn. And remember, h6 cannot happen to attack the knight because queen b3 check, and now we're gonna win the exchange. The king moves, and then you can, you see, the king moves, you go, you know, you can make forks, right? And then that allows you to win the rook. King goes this way, same thing, attacking the queen, so the rook will have to give up. So h6 is not possible, and not even like a move like queen to f8 really helps, because rook to d1, attacking the knight, rook to d8, seems like black is completely defended, but this pawn is a weakness, such a massive weakness. Queen to c7 comes now, so that this variation doesn't work, because queen to c7 was not going to happen anyway, even if the knight then moves somewhere. Obviously, knight moving away now cannot be played because you got double attack on the rook, and instead queen to e8 to stop, you know, to protect the knight further. e5 attacks the rook. The rook will have to move back, and then you can play this move. So let's make the very last recap, and then we'll close this video. So in the classical Sicilian, g6, castle, bishop g7, you take the knight, d takes, a4. We'll look at the variation bishop g4 straight away. Attack it. Take, take. And now let's look at this one, e5 instead of knight f6. Okay, queen a3 comes now, targeting this very well known weakness. Okay, b6 by black, a5. Besides, we're also threatening to take this pawn. You see these two pawns here doubled up, and so on. If the pawn takes these two pawns islands, we've talked about it already. So rook to b8 now. What happens now? d3, normal moves, knight e7, bishop e3, capitalizing, putting more pressure on this pawn. Castle, queen to b3. Seems weird because now we're allowing an attack on the queen, but this is just a provocation. If the pawn does take this pawn, then queen to a3. That's it. Attack here and here, and you're winning. So obviously, let's not assume our opponent will be that naive, but rather play another move like king to h8 to unpin the pawn. So in order to be able to play f5, okay, take the pawn in b6 now. And when black takes back, at least keeping the pawns united. Rook to a7. By the way, a move like f5 now is not working because you will simply play queen e6, putting pressure on this knight, also putting pressure on the pawn in c6. Besides, you're also going to be playing bishop g5 to finalize the attack on that knight. Let's make an example. If black plays bishop f6 now to defend the knight more, bishop to h6, deflecting the rook, and we will take this bishop. So that doesn't work. What if rook to e8, defending the knight more? Okay, well, bishop to g5, finalizing the attack on the knight. Okay, bishop to f8, defending more. Rook to d7, kicking the queen away from that square. Queen to c8, pinning the rook at least. But now bishop check. Only move is bishop blocks. Now you take, and you're going to have double attack on this e7, the piece in e7. So in this position, the last thing we're going to look at, what if the knight just, gets out of the attack, attacks the rook, and yeah, what happens now? Okay, now sacrificing the rook for the bishop. How about that? King takes, check, and we're targeting this one. So even if queen blocks, it doesn't do anything. Queen takes rook, and that's it. And back in this position after rook a7, by the way, we saw what happens after f5, but that gives us the possibility to play queen to e6. That's too strong. What if instead our opponent plays rook to e8, trying to swap with us? Okay, fine, take, and now take the pawn in b6. This is enough advantage to win this game. Rook to b8 counter-attacking doesn't matter. You also take in c5. And there's no problem about b2 because you're attacking the knight. And this is a completely winning position, of course. Oh, by the way, another thing I forgot to mention about the same variation. Bishop b5, g6, and so on. So we're taking this from the start. Take, a4, and we're looking at a5. Okay, now we know we played d3. We mentioned knight f6. What about bishop g4? Now here, it might be tempted to play knight d2 to defend the knight and everything, but to be fair, there is no black pawn in e5, so we don't really care about this knight attacking e5 at the moment. So the best thing to do is to start an attack on the bishop immediately, and when they take, you take back. Now black can indeed play e5, but you play bishop e3, putting pressure on the pawn, and now b6. Queen to g3, puts more pressure on e5, knight to e7 comes by black, knight to d2, and we want to retain the possibility to play knight c4. So here after knight d2, castle by black, knight to c4, and after queen to c7, putting more defense over e5, we play f4. Now here, if black takes, now here we're obviously putting a lot of attack over e5, so after takes, and bishop takes back, the queen will have to move. Queen to b7, because obviously if you move to d7, knight b6 will make a fork. Queen to b7, bishop to e5, forcing a swap. And obviously if bishop takes, queen takes back. If instead black plays f6, okay, well then bishop d6. What can our opponent do at this point? Nothing really works. If black plays b5 to kick the knight away and maybe, give the queen some more freedom. Take, but now knight takes a5. If in this position black plays rook f to e8, for example, right, you play bishop to f4, threatening a fork. And when the rook goes back, you play c3. And this rook in a8 cannot really develop. Can't go to b8, obviously. If you go to d8, right, then you run into bishop c7, making a fork to these two. And then the position is falling apart for black. What if the rook goes to c8? The thing is, it's behind two black pawns. And knight d6 comes, by the way. You forgot about that, right? So there's really not much that black can do. What about g5 maybe? Trying to get rid of this unbelievable bishop. You just go back to d6. And now after rook to f7, the black player might be planning to play knight to g6 and from there finally move it somewhere else where it could be doing something. e5, look, position evaluated +4 for a reason. There is no way out of this trouble. Taking the pawn here will weaken the king side. We're going to take the rook, then this king is not going to survive at all. Also, the pawn in g5 will fall. Pushing f5 means we're going to have a very strong pass pawn. Knight to g6 maybe, but then again, you just play, you have a pass pawn. So, look, there's too many things that can happen. You're going to have to take it from there, but you're completely winning no matter what your opponent does in this position. So here after bishop d6, let's look at this other move. What if rook a to e8? Okay, rook a to e1. And now two options. If f5, the idea of opening the game for black, okay, e5. b5 attacks the knight, fine, take this pawn. That doesn't work. Queen a6 could be an idea. Also, that was the idea behind b5, and now the black player should be winning this pawn back and opening the file. Maybe the rooks can come and play like that. But I just play knight to b3. And you go into this pawn no matter what. So pawn takes doesn't work. If queen takes, then rook a1 wins the game immediately. The only square to go for the queen will be b4. But you can take the pawn in c5 with the bishop and you're achieving what you wanted. Rook f7. In this position, instead of f5, what about rook f7? Okay, e5 comes, right? Remember this pattern. f5 by black, again, you're just producing a very strong pass pawn. If instead the pawn takes e5, okay, take, bishop takes in c5. It's an extremely powerful move, should win the game, because now you're also going to take the other pawns. This cannot be taken because of knight d6.